Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today, Ash Cloud is partnering with CSIRO to bring you Andy Sheppard, the Chief Research Scientist for Biosecurity at CSIRO, where he leads efforts to protect Australia, its neighbours and trading partners from plant, animal and human pests and diseases. Building local and global partnerships to understand the biology of these threats across their native and invaded range so that intervention opportunities can be implemented is a key part of his work. Andy is also the Co-Executive Director of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries and CSIRO's joint Catalysing Australian Biosecurity Initiative.
Biosecurity is often conflated with One Health, but it is generally managing biological threats, preventing and managing biological threats. So biological threats can be very broad. They can be pests and weeds in agriculture, or they can be diseases of humans and animals.
Australian biosecurity has a long and successful history.
Australia very successfully controlled prickly pear cactus back in the 1930s through the introduction, the discovery, risk analysis and an introduction of highly specific natural enemies to these weeds, which hadn't been introduced into Australia when they arrived, to effectively readdress the ecological balance.
Balance is critical.
And so it's this balance that you need to do with being able to encourage and support trade and people movement while managing the risks that those pathways, those trade and people movement become pathways for a movement of other organisms. And this is, if you like, where the concept of biosecurity emerged.
Climate change is creating additional threats and challenges.
Climate is changing, our environment is changing, and that creates threats because our environments become less resilient under climate change, which means they become more vulnerable to being invaded by some of these species. And you kind of got this nexus between trying to build resilient ecosystems to climate change, which are themselves being underridden by increasing spread and movement of invasive species.
The consequences of these climate change-induced challenges can be far-reaching.
The blue tongue disease of sheep is endemic to Africa, and most of the time it just stays in Africa and it kills sheep, but it's carried by cattle as well, which don't suffer from it. And it's spread by these biting midges, or what we call culicoid midges. And with climate change and the changing weather patterns, these midges get to move, and they carry the disease with them. And we're seeing in Europe, this is the second major outbreak in which the midges are carrying the disease over from North Africa because of climate change and storms and so on that are associated with climate change. Those midges then transfer the disease into local animals in Europe. The local midges then pick them up and they spread, and all of a sudden we're seeing outbreaks of disease that were restricted to Africa now in places like Belgium and Northern Europe, where they've never been seen before.
Biosecurity cannot be done alone. Collaboration and partnerships are critical.
I've been working very closely with the Americans. CSIRO's had a very long relationship with USDA, where we collaborate, where they help us with organisms that have come into Australia from the New World, and we help them with organisms that have come into the US from the Old World, and that is increasingly becoming work that we're doing now across pests, weeds, and diseases. And so it's really exciting because you get to travel and visit these places where these organisms have come from, but it's also enjoyable because you're able to collaborate with researchers from other parts of the world that often have other skills.
Cross-cultural teamwork is also critical.
There was a massive IUCN, International Conservation of Nature, Congress in Hawaii in 2016, the World Conservation Congress, and that brought together a lot of scientists in the region that understood and wanted to do something about the impacts of these invasive species on natural ecosystems across the Pacific, and in the Pacific, basically, a lot of these pests affect both, crops that the locals depend on, while also affecting their environment. So A classic case there is the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which literally takes out coconut palms, and coconut palms are they're called the tree of life in the Pacific because they provide shade, they provide food, they're part of the biodiversity of the ecosystem, and so on. And this one pest was effectively taking out what the country depended on. So we took an advantage from the fact that we were all in one place in Honolulu in 2016 to think about how could we collaborate and develop a program of work that would broadly support the Pacific communities. And that led to a three-way collaboration between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand to work with our Pacific Island colleagues to help develop some management strategies collectively with them. In fact, they led the actual development of them to try and tackle some of the big priority concerns that they'd raised with us. And one of the outcomes of that was a letter that came from all of the presidents of the Micronesian islands to President Biden, asking for his administration to support these challenging areas for them.
Effective biosecurity initiatives involve neighbours and trading partners.
Critically important to Australia's biosecurity system that we have strong biosecurity processes in our neighbouring countries, particularly the ones we trade with. It is critically important that we help support the build-up of capability and capacity in those countries. But there is also a direct benefit for us, because if we're working with them, we get a better understanding of what the risks in their countries are, and that benefits Australia in terms of what kind of process we can put in place. And where we probably do most work in that in CSIRO is around understanding the movement of animal diseases. So the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness in Geelong has a large international research program where they're doing work in Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, and other countries in the region to help them upskill in terms of their diagnostics and risk assessment and response capability, while at the same time we're getting very good intelligence, openly on what diseases they've got.
Priorities frequently change.
In the last 12 months, that's been surpassed again by high-path avian influenza, which we know is now very widespread in other parts of the world and can come in naturally on migratory bird populations. The current activity in the government across multiple departments in CSIRO around high-path avian influenza kind of has almost surpassed what we did on lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease. So again, every single new threat has to be evaluated, and our response to it is dependent on the perceived level of risk.
Technology is providing exciting opportunities.
But with the latest gene editing capabilities, we're starting to develop genetic control options to try to much more effectively, or we believe much more effectively, suppress some of these widespread pests than we've ever been able to in the past. And an obvious example of that where we think we might be able to make a difference is around cane toads. And while none of those approaches have yet got to the point of being field trialed, some are very close, and they're really exciting because we've got the potential to actually either massively reduce or in some cases potentially wipe out some of these very widespread invasive populations and remove their impacts.
Human health, environmental health, plant health, and animal health are all connected.
And this concept of One Health that we talked about earlier, where it's all connected, right? And that as a species, we're dependent on our environment. We're dependent on, from a food security point of view, from plant health and animal health, and the diseases that emerge and circulate within those systems, can affect our livelihoods. Means that we can no longer treat these as separate sectors for research. And it's very important to look where research in one sector can support improvements in other sectors.
Andy, thank you very much for joining me today.
A pleasure, Ash.
So you have been working in biosecurity pretty much your entire career. Can you tell us a bit about your background, how you got into biosecurity, and also how the biosecurity threats and challenges have changed over that time?
Yeah, look, sure, Ash. I'll do the best I can, and if I start to drag on, you let me know. So, look, biosecurity. Let's start with some definitions. Biosecurity is often conflated with One Health, but it is generally managing biological threats, preventing and managing biological threats. So, biological threats can be very broad. They can be pests and weeds in agriculture, or they can be diseases of humans and animals. And the whole process that in Australia and New Zealand we call biosecurity is around effectively trying to prevent those impacts happening in the first place. And when they do happen, or in many cases become very widespread in the way that their impacts, it's about developing approaches to be able to manage them. And the reason I kind of give you that definition is because if I go way back to the start of my career, my research was very focused around managing the impacts of some of these widespread. In my case, the early part of career was invasive plants or weeds that had got into Australia with agriculture. The agricultural systems are not native to Australia, so everything about Australian agriculture is exotic. And as we progressed agriculture in Australia, we brought in intentionally initially, and then through a lack of effective controls accidentally, a lot of exotic species that are associated with agriculture, and then these spread and had major impacts. So in Australia, the classic one that everybody talks about in the weed space is prickly pear cactus that spread over literally hundreds of thousands of square kilometres in the early part of the 20th century, and was massively restricting Australia's capacity to do livestock and sheep agriculture. And that's a classic example of how when you try and do agriculture in a new area without a biosecurity background, these massive problems emerge, and you have to do something about them. And so the first part of my career was trying to address some of these really widespread weed problems that were having major impacts on agriculture, in the same manner with which Australia very successfully controlled prickly pear cactus back in the 1930s, through the introduction, the discovery, risk analysis, and an introduction of highly specific natural enemies to these weeds, which hadn't been introduced into Australia when they arrived, to effectively readdress the ecological balance and have these organisms, both insects and plant diseases, suppress these massive population outbreaks back to levels where they had much lesser impacts. And I did that for 15 years, and suddenly realized that, or started to realize, there was this much broader discipline of biosecurity in which my research was playing, a highly impactful part, because the programs I led saved billions of dollars to Australian farmers, but it was one component of a continuum which starts with, trying to stop new stuff coming in. If it does get in, eradicating it, and if you can't eradicate it, or it's already been there for a while, coming up with broader landscape control approaches.
So thank you for that. And how is the biosecurity threat or the challenges changed over recent decades? We've got the fact that, so depending on whether it's plants or animals, but you've got less area, less hectares of wilderness, less hectares of nature, greater interactions between humans and wild animals, greater volumes or numbers of people and goods being traded via shipping and air. So all of that sort of thing means that everything's mixing much more quickly and much more thoroughly. So how has that affected the challenges of having effective biosecurity?
Yeah, well, look, there's a whole history to this, which I kind of started on, which is, when Europeans first colonized Australia, they brought a lot of animals and plants with them that made them feel at home. In fact, New Zealand had what it called a climatization society, which deliberately encouraged people to bring things like hedgehogs, which now are causing catastrophic impacts in New Zealand. So it all started out of us deliberately bringing them all in. And as a result of that, in Australia, most of our invasive animals or organisms that started to have great impacts were invasive animals like feral pigs, cattle, donkeys, rabbits, you name it, and weeds, because people brought in plants because they love plants, or they came in as part of our agriculture. So in the early phase, Australia was really suffering from invasive vertebrate pests and weeds. As times changed and we realized the error of our ways, and I think Australia had its first Quarantine Act in the early 1900s that started to close the borders, we were able to shut down the arrival of more species. And so it was more to do with new species getting in through trade pathways and human travel pathways that were either we weren't effectively managing or had opened up because of new trade. And agricultural trade and tourism is extremely important to Australia and the Australian economy. And so it's this balance that you need to do with being able to encourage and support trade and people movement while managing the risks that those pathways, those trade and people movement become pathways for a movement of other organisms. And this is, if you like, where the concept of biosecurity emerged, about how do you prevent or prepare yourself for the arrival of some of these things. And obviously the threat levels of arrival of these things change over time. As you've alluded to, they change in the context of the fact that Australia continues to grow its trade, and it trades, it imports a lot. It is increasingly, with our car industry now, we have to import every single car that we sell, and those cars can come in with pest organisms on them. So the environment that allows these things to come in has changed. But as you also say, the climate is changing, our environment is changing, and that creates threats because our environments become less resilient under climate change, which means they become more vulnerable to being invaded by some of these species. And you kind of got this nexus between trying to build resilient ecosystems to climate change, which are themselves being underwritten by, increasing spread and movement of invasive species. So, and there are really subtle interactions there that happen, and a classic one that's actually going on as we speak in Europe is a disease of sheep called blue tongue. Now, the blue tongue disease of sheep is endemic to Africa, and most of the time it just stays in Africa and it kills sheep. But it's carried by cattle as well, which don't suffer from it. And it's spread by these biting midges, or what we call culicoid midges. And with climate change and the changing weather patterns, these midges get to move. And they carry the disease with them. And we're seeing in Europe, this is the second major outbreak in which the midges are carrying the disease over from North Africa because of climate change and storms and so on that are associated with climate change. Those midges then transfer the disease into local animals in Europe. The local midges then pick them up and they spread, and all of a sudden we're seeing outbreaks of disease that were restricted to Africa now in places like Belgium and Northern Europe, where they've never been seen before.
So they've managed to move all the way, not just to, the Mediterranean countries, southern Italy, Spain and Greece. They've crossed, essentially crossed the Alps, and they're up in Northern Europe.
That's right, because the disease is now the disease is now available to be picked up by these vectors, potential vectors that were never exposed to them before, and these vectors can take them north. So you see that pattern of things being moved. Now there are other ways that climate obviously leads to species being moved around as well. Another classic in Europe is the arrival of Asian tiger mosquito, which is a tropical mosquito. But now, they had to do major controls of water areas at the Paris Olympics because Asian tiger mosquito is actually now endemic in Paris, and that's because changing climates and the introduction, fortuitous for Asian tiger mosquito, the introduction of it into Europe, and the spread north from there.
So that, I guess, there's many things that come from that. One is the complexity in actually, I guess, policing, for want of a better term. It's hard enough to police people coming across borders, let alone policing midges.
Yeah,
Don't have any documentation and they're tiny.
yeah.
And then from that perspective, the need to collaborate with people in not just in your country or your neighbor, but maybe two or three countries away, because a combined effort is going to be much more powerful than anyone trying to do this alone.
Absolutely, Ash. So the concept of biosecurity is to protect your own jurisdiction, but you get much better protection if all of your neighbors are also undertaking similar kinds of controls. And so that's why strong collaboration, particularly between, and that's how my career started, countries where these organisms came from, so you can understand their biology and possible ways to control them in their native range, where generally they're a lot less abundant, while also studying in what we call the invaded range, where they're causing problems, to really identify, not only understand the pathways and manage the pathways, but come up with means to be able to be able to deal with them. And that requires a lot of collaboration. So in my career, I've collaborated. The first 10 years or so of my career, I was working in Europe, and we were working on a lot of these pests and weeds that came from Europe. So we were working with European researchers and so on, collaborating with them and their institutions. And then, as my career has developed, we've been working very closely with the Americans. CSIRO's had a very long relationship with USDA, where we collaborate, where they help us with organisms that have come into Australia from the New World, and we help them with organisms that have come into the US from the Old World. And that's that is increasingly becoming work that we're doing now across pests, weeds, and diseases. And so it's really exciting, because you get to travel and visit these places where these organisms have come from, but it's also enjoyable because you're able to collaborate with researchers from other parts of the world that often have other skills and useful skills.
Once again, so many points that come from that. I think you alluded to, or you mentioned the fact that these biosecurity threats, these organisms are often less prevalent in the countries where they're endemic. And my understanding is that's because they will be predators or competition, or they'll be in a
Exactly.
balanced ecosystem. And then suddenly when you move them to a place where there's no natural predators, um, or if it's a plant, no animals that are eating, or I guess that's a predator because it's still predation, or no pests or diseases that impact them, then that's when they can really take off.
Yeah. Look, every organism has, even bacteria have natural enemies that in many cases are highly specific to them. And if they manage to escape them, that allows their populations to explode. Or we might put them into artificial environments, which they're also highly adapted to, which will allow them to explode. But if if you want a strong biological way of trying to manage those problems is to find those natural enemies, as we call them, and reunite them, and that can lead to suppression. And we use that now in Australia to control invertebrate pests, weeds, and including some vertebrates. And a classic example there is the way we've very successfully controlled European rabbits in Australia using a few viruses which are highly specific to European rabbits.
I certainly remember spending time in rural Australia back probably in the late 90s, before the Kalichi virus was introduced, and there were literally hundreds of thousands of them all over the place. You could see the plagues, and then within a year or two there were virtually none, and that it still
Yeah. Well, there's good data to show that before we introduced the first disease to control, our pathogen to control European rabbits, which was myxomatosis in the 1950s, the rabbit populations in Australia were 7 times higher than they currently are. So, people may still see a lot of rabbits, but it's nothing like what it used to be.
you used to almost trip over them when you were walking through paddocks and through the bush. They were so abundant.
Well, there were plagues of them, right? They were just
Oh, completely.
scouring the landscape.
So back to the partnerships. Earlier this year, back in
Yeah.
June, you were part of a team across Micronesia that developed a partnership with in terms
Yeah.
of approaching the United States for um, strengthening their biosecurity needs. Could you tell us about, I guess, the journey, the process of
Sure.
the needs, and then how you built the teams, how you built consensus, and how the outcome was?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Pacific, or opportunities in the Pacific, started around about 2016. There was a massive IUCN, International Conservation of Nature, Congress in Hawaii in 2016, the World Conservation Congress. And that brought together a lot of scientists in the region that understood and wanted to do something about the impacts of these invasive species on natural ecosystems across the Pacific. And in the Pacific, basically, a lot of these pests affect both, crops that the locals depend on, while also affecting their environment. So, a classic case there is the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which literally takes out coconut palms, and coconut palms are they're called the tree of life in the Pacific because they provide shade, they provide food, they're part of the biodiversity of the ecosystem, and so on. And this one pest was effectively taking out what the country depended on. So we took an advantage from the fact that we were all in one place in Honolulu in 2016 to think about how could we collaborate and develop a program of work that would broadly support the Pacific communities in helping them to manage some of these pests, and start to put in place the biosecurity systems necessary to stop the continued movement of these new pests around the Pacific. And that led to a three-way collaboration between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, in which we combined our resources, if you like, to work with our Pacific Island colleagues to help develop some management strategies collectively with them. In fact, they led the actual development of them to try and tackle some of the big priority concerns that they'd raised with us. And that led to a couple of other meetings. We had a couple of meetings in Micronesia. There's been a meeting recently in Fiji. It's basically bringing together Micronesia, which the United States generally look after, Polynesia that New Zealand has a big role supporting, and Melanesia, where Australia plays a key role, to say, can we work together at scale to do it? And we produced 3 actions plans. One was around invasive ants, one was around weeds, and one was to try and tackle this problem of coconut rhinoceros beetle.
And where is that today? How far is that developed? And I guess, and also who has it grown? What agencies? How many agencies and countries and everything like that are you trying to rally around and build consensus with? I imagine it's quite a few and it's quite complex.
Yeah, look, it's quite a big consortium now. I suppose the challenge in these kind of collaboration activities is a constant supply of resources. And for the first few years, it was all done on the smell of an oil. It was really all done on the smell of an oily rag. What's changed, of course, as everyone knows, is that there's a lot of money going into the Pacific now because the Quad countries that work together, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States in the Pacific, are trying to support the Pacific in the face of large amounts of Chinese investment. And so that started to create a flow of resources. Now, I won't say that we've attracted a large number of resources yet, but we, as I say, have worked with our Pacific colleagues, provide the academic support to help them lobby for resources. And one of the outcomes of that was a letter that came from all of the presidents of the Micronesian islands to President Biden, asking for his administration to support these challenging areas for them, and actually help operationalize these action plans that we've put together. Now that hasn't led to any funding yet, but we're getting that kind of feeling that it's not too far away.
And I imagine that, successful programs in this space will be very important to these countries, because many of them are at the forefront of climate change in terms of rising sea levels, and things like coconut palms, in addition to the shade and the food and everything that you mentioned. They're also important building materials in many of these countries, and in terms of holding fragile sand type soils together and coastal erosion, they play really critical roles in those sides of things as well. So
Yeah, and there's another angle to this, which is actually the US military. So as we all know, that US military is pretty active in the Pacific, and historically their activities have led to the movement of some really nasty invasive species around the Pacific. But they recognize that now and do a huge amount of work in the islands where they have bases, in terms of A, putting strong biosecurity measures in place, but B, also providing funding support to tackle some of the problems that they've created. And that has been another source of funding where we have been quite successful.
that's a very interesting point there, because especially when you fly, anyone who's flown in or out of Australia will be aware of how seriously Australia takes biosecurity, how on the aeroplane before you land, there's videos, there's signs everywhere. You have to sign declarations about things. But then as soon as you have troops moving that don't come in through commercial airports, the customs quarantine situations and the visa situations are completely different. So you have these kind of back doors that can pop up here, there. And obviously from a biosecurity threat, they're agnostic whether they're coming in through the front door or the back door.
Absolutely right. And of course, when it's a military emergency, then things like biosecurity are generally drop down the priority list of what they need to do. So again, we need to support the development of resilient systems which will operate even in situations of emergencies.
And in terms of the partnerships and the collaboration, my understanding is that many of the CSIRO scientists who work on some of these topics and in this space actually spend quite a bit of time on the ground in neighboring countries, be that Papua New Guinea or Indonesia or elsewhere in the world. How important are the relationships? Or do you want to just sort of, what's the process?
Yeah.
If you're one of those people, what's the process? What sort of time do you spend on those? Who do you get to meet? What sort of relationships and understanding of those local environments and cultures do they get to experience?
Look, I mean, there are many ways in which the Australian, governments and public activities obviously support what we do in the region. And as I talked about earlier, it's critically important to Australia's biosecurity system that we have strong biosecurity processes in our neighbouring countries, particularly the ones we trade with, or in the case of the Torres Strait, there's an agreement that allows people to move freely between the southern islands of parts of Papua New Guinea and the Torres Strait. So there are highly well-structured processes to support biosecurity in the context of that. But it is critically important that we help support the build-up of capability and capacity in those countries. But there is also a direct benefit for us, because if we're working with them, we get a better understanding of what the risks in their countries are, and that benefits Australia in terms of what kind of process we can put in place. And where we probably do most work in CSIRO is around understanding the movement of animal diseases. So the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness in Geelong has a large international research program where they're doing work in Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, and other countries in the region, to help them upskill in terms of their diagnostics and risk assessment and response capability, while at the same time we're getting very good intelligence, openly on what diseases they've got, how different they are, exactly what those diseases are genetically in terms of strains, so that we understand and can prepare and make sure we've got the right kinds of vaccines should ever they get into Australia. So at the same time, we're helping them so that they know what they've got, but when they know what they've got, that helps us to understand how we protect ourselves from it.
I imagine there's backwards and forwards in terms of if there's a vaccine that if you get the strains and then you can develop a vaccine, then you can then decrease the incidence and give that or help them get that vaccine so you can decrease the incidence amongst their population. That will benefit them, but it also protects Australia because there's just a lower disease incidence, which reduces the threat level.
Yeah, look, obviously each country has its own national priorities, and they don't always align. So Australia gave a huge amount of money to Indonesia when foot and mouth disease arrived in Indonesia about 3 years ago in order to give them access to many vaccines. But at the end of the day, it was such a big outbreak in Indonesia that the Indonesian government decided that a national vaccination program wasn't actually the best solution for them. And so, it didn't necessarily lead to a point where Australia would have been better protected. But that's part and parcel of us each collectively understanding what our own priorities are and trying to find areas of consistent overlap.
In terms of and this is a bit back to the One Health concept, obviously COVID was a huge global pandemic recently that did actually very much affect, the West as well as the developing world. But then earlier, late, the 17, 18, 19, there was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And a lot of these diseases are zoonotic, so they originate in animals and then they are transferred to humans. And then you have other diseases like the foot and mouth crisis, which is cloven hoof animals only. So obviously humans are completely immune to any impacts of that other than the impacts on their livestock and their livelihoods and the food production system. How do you balance up those different, and then you've got the plant pests and stuff like that. How do you balance up the prioritization and across such a broad variety of threats?
Look, to start with, you have to understand each individual threat, right? No two threats are completely alike. And you've got to understand the threats from multiple angles. And then through that, the government generally undertake some form of prioritization as to where they're going to make their investment. And we've seen from these infectious diseases, we've seen wave after wave of new occurrences in the region that threaten Australia, and we've seen as a result that the priority species for Australia has changed over time. And just to give you an example of that, so when foot and mouth disease arrived in Indonesia, Australia got very concerned and spent a huge amount of time trying to protect itself from any arrival of foot and mouth disease and preparing itself should it get in. All right. Now, foot and mouth disease is only transferred between animals, touching animals. May travel a bit in water, but generally it's through animal contact. Then another disease that also arrived in our part of the world, called lumpy skin disease, is another disease of cattle, but it's transferred by insects. And as I've alluded to already, these insects can blow in on the wind, right? And so lumpy skin disease surpassed foot and mouth disease on the risk table, because this disease could actually blow in its vectors on the wind into Australia from Indonesia. And all of a sudden, we put a lot of our energy and investment into understanding lumpy skin disease, being able to develop models that allow us to understand how it could get into Australia. It was also that concern was also supported by the recent outbreak in Australia we've had of Japanese encephalitis, which is also a vector-borne disease that got in. So we became very, very concerned about that, and we've done a lot of work on that. And then in the last 12 months, that's been surpassed again by high-path avian influenza, which we know is now very widespread in other parts of the world and can come in naturally on migratory bird populations. And the current activity in the government across multiple departments in CSIRO around high path avian influenza kind of has almost surpassed what we did on lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease. So again, every single new threat has to be evaluated, and our response to it is dependent on the perceived level of risk.
It sounds like there's no risk of you being out of a job anytime soon.
No, certainly not. But also, the risk of this is also that Australia, gets very concerned and starts, running around like a flock of headless chickens, trying to do stuff when really there's, in many instances, there's not a huge amount they can do. And high path avian influenza is a classic case of that. If it gets in, there's not much you can do to stop it spreading, and there's not much you can do to control it. So, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to do the maximum to be able to understand and think about what the consequences might be.
We've mostly spoken across the international perspective, diseases coming from outside Australia into Australia, or outside the US into to the United States or Europe. And from Cape York or Darwin down to Melbourne and Tasmania it's a fair old hike. Likewise, from the Texas US Mexican border up to New England or up to Washington State. So as well as the external side of biosecurity, what's going on internally within countries to try and once a threat comes in or limit the spread within a country?
Yeah, so there's a fairly standard biosecurity approach to how you deal with it. When something arrives, the first thing you do is you see if you can delimit it, which means that you can work out exactly where it is and how far it's spread. And if you can delimit it, then you can think about potentially eradicating it. Not all delimited populations can be eradicated by any stretch of the imagination, and red imported fire ant is a classic case of that. But the first cab off the rank is to try and look at eradication. Now, if eradication can't work, then you move to containment, which is, can you contain it within the delimited area? And if you can't do that, then you look for broad, wide scale management options. And Australia and New Zealand have very well planned processes to go through those different stages. In terms, if you can't eradicate it, and probably 95% of the cases you can't eradicate it, then you have to go to long-term management, and that's also an area where Australia is leading the world. So as I've already talked about using viruses to control rabbits and using insects to control prickly pear, but with the latest gene editing capabilities, we're starting to develop genetic control options to try to much more effectively, or we believe much more effectively, suppress some of these widespread pests than we've ever been able to in the past. And an obvious example of that where we think we might be able to make a difference is around cane toads. So cane toads has been an intractable problem for Australia, but you can use genetic approaches that can change the effectively reduce the fitness of the cane toad in a manner where that reduced fitness can spread through the population and suppress the population. The classic way of doing that is creating a situation where all the offspring are a single sex, but there are many approaches, and we're learning more of them. And while none of those approaches have yet got to the point of being field trialed, some are very close, and they're really exciting because we've got the potential to actually either massively reduce or in some cases potentially wipe out some of these very widespread invasive populations and remove their impacts.
Because cane toads are, another one of those that were species that became a huge problem, but they were actually deliberately introduced to deal with pests within the sugarcane industry.
That's true, Ash. And we're often beaten over the head by the cane toad example because we're introducing stuff and that cane toads are introduced. But what people don't sort of decide to ignore is that when cane toads were introduced in Australia, it was open slather. You could introduce anything you wanted, you felt like, and as a result, nobody did any work or any science about what the real negative impacts of cane toads might be before they were introduced, which of course is not the case today.
Well, I think it's a very much a continuously an environment where you need to be continuously learning. Because if I think back to the foot and mouth outbreak in the United Kingdom, 15 or 20 years ago, they were slaughtering the animals that had the disease, and then they were incinerating the carcasses to try and destroy the
Yeah,
virus. And
yeah,
they soon found out that within 15, 20, 50, 100 kilometers or whatever it was, they'd get secondary outbreaks, and the
yeah.
virus wasn't being killed by the incineration. It was just being put up in the air, and then, as happens in the United Kingdom, it rains and down it comes, and another whole bunch of animals were.
Yeah, which is part of the learning, as you talked about. Always, we're constantly learning as to what's practical and what isn't. Um, and they put some really, internationally acclaimed academics in to try and help them better understand the foot and mouth disease outbreak and manage it. And they largely failed, right? Because their simplistic models didn't pan out in the real world.
Back to the complexity of nature and how everything's so interactive, and how you change one
Yeah.
thing, it's lots of everything else somehow changes as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's from a science perspective, that's the real excitement of biological systems, is they're always complex, and there's always going to be surprises.
And on that, going back to irrespective of the species, you've got areas where diseases, say foot and mouth disease or whatever, are endemic, and you have a natural resistance to those diseases within those
Yep.
populations. And then you have areas where they're non-endemic and you have no natural resistance. And then in terms of your, be that a wheat rust or foot and mouth disease, or anything with the beetle pests in various palm species. And if you start including, you can't change the genetics of your animals for resilience to every single disease, because then you'd lose all your productivity benefits.
Yeah.
But then you want to be able to change it once you move from prevention to adaptation and management. You want to be able to change it really, really fast. How is that challenge sort of viewed within the biosecurity sort of space? And back to the use of tools like CRISPR, etc., that can rapidly
Yeah.
accelerate genetic change. Do you see opportunities there to
Oh,
for that
absolutely.
technology to make differences?
Absolutely. CRISPR has been a complete game changer because now we can engineer um, uh, uh, DNA and RNA down to individual base pairs, right? So it's the ultimate of engineering tools. So that means you can start to identify resistant genes and engineer them from one population that has got resistance into a naive population as one way of being able to control diseases, which we could never do before because we were groping around in the dark. So that's been an absolute game changer, but also that you can exploit that difference in susceptibility between populations to help in their control. And a great example of that is the European carp, which is a massive pest problem in Australia. It's 90% of the fish biomass in our biggest catchment, the Murray-Darling Basin, is European carp. And we've got a disease we know is highly pathogenic to European carp. And because we understand the genetics, we know that the European carp populations are introduced into Australia have never had any exposure in their evolution to this disease. And so we know that if and when Australia deems it sensible to try and use this disease to control carp, our carp populations will be hard hit and be suppressed for long term, because they'd have zero innate resistance that, of course, exists in the European carp populations that have been exposed to this disease in Europe. And we understand all that because of the ability to use these genetic tools.
So what's the process? Because there's the good examples are the European rabbit and Kalichi virus, and then there's the other side of that, which is things like cane toads, where there was no how is this going to impact in or how is this going to impact the environment more broadly. I imagine there's some quite rigorous processes that are put together in terms of how you evaluate, and then how you, because there's literally millions and millions of species out there, including
extremely,
So
they're extremely they are extremely rigorous processes. And before I go into the detail, I will say that they also were developed through a lot of international collaboration, right? There are now international standards, us working with the Canadians and the Americans and South Africans primarily around developing risk assessment programs for evaluating the potential introduction of beneficial organisms to control pests, has come from a lot of really strong early work by Australia, but through international collaboration. And it goes through a completely rigorous, scientifically evaluated assessment process, which is, in simple terms, it is demonstrating that whatever you introduce will have zero non-target impacts on anything other than what you want to introduce it to control. And there are experimental procedures that allow you to do that. And also at the same time, trying to evaluate its likely effectiveness. And then that whole dossier of information is independently evaluated by another bunch of scientists who have the opportunity to pick holes in it and ask you to go back and do more work where necessary. And that process, that's been in place now since probably the early 1980s, has meant that we've had really no, or certainly in an Australian context, none of these non-target impacts of anything we've introduced.
That's wonderful here on all fronts, because the impact of it and effectiveness in terms of making the right decisions for an Australian perspective, but also that broad collaboration across all those other countries.
Yeah, but there are international regulatory challenges, and a classic one is to do with this virus we've got for carp. Is because carp is an important aquaculture species, particularly in Asia. This disease is a critical threat to those industries, and so this disease is actually one of the diseases that the World Organization for Animal Health expects all of its members to actually report on every time an occurrence occurs. So it's a reportable disease that Australia wants to release into the environment. So from an international regulatory and political perspective, that's obviously quite challenging. Every jurisdiction has the right to do what it wants to do, but we have a lot of people overseas. We need to, not just in Australia, that we need to ensure that we can convince, or at least reassure them, that we're very confident in what we're going to do before we do it.
And as signatories to many of those conventions, you don't want to just tear up the convention, because you want them to honor it from your side. So becomes I guess you possibly transition from a pure scientist to someone who's part diplomat, part scientist over the years.
Look, and the other thing is that we trade with a lot of these partners, right? And there's one way in which they can get back to us if they don't like what we're doing, and that's they can shut down our trade, as we've seen on numerous occasions from numerous countries, right? So, and primary Australia's biosecurity system and the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry that manages that is there. Their role is to ensure that Australia has effective trading pathways and volumes. So yeah, it's all mixed together in a blancmange of managing relationships.
That once again, that sounds like you get to travel around a lot, you get to meet lots and lots of interesting people and see lots of interesting things. So that sounds
yeah, I do. I'm very privileged. Very privileged.
We're almost up to time, but before we go, is there anything else that you think we should mention that we haven't previously discussed?
As you say, we've gone around most of it. Look, I think what I will say is, and this is something I've learned as I've gone through my career, is we've traditionally tended to divide up the biosecurity sectors into animal health, plant health, and environmental health, and done our science very, very siloed within those those different sectors, right? And this concept of One Health that we talked about earlier, where it's all connected, right? And that as a species, we're dependent on our environment. We're dependent on, from a food security point of view, from plant health and animal health, and the diseases that emerge and circulate within those systems, can affect our livelihoods. Means that we can no longer treat these as separate sectors for research. And it's very important to look where research in one sector can support improvements in other sectors. And a good example of this is the work that started out in animal diseases, in terms of understanding the disease in the organism, and understanding how resistant animals develop resistance to them by being able to screen very rapidly through cell culture techniques how the disease infects, what are the resistance mechanisms, and what are the resistance genes associated with those mechanisms. And we've been able to do that in great detail in the animal sector because there are relatively few animal diseases. Animal health and animal biosecurity people are very lucky because they don't have that many diseases to worry about, whereas in the plant space, there are thousands of diseases. But we've been able to translate that capability over to the plant world, and are now very, very rapidly being able to identify resistance genes in crops that allow us to be able to use some of these novel genetic approaches to rapidly develop and engineer resistant varieties of crops. So that's another area. I think it's worth emphasizing that the learnings and the capacity to take science in one sector and transfer it and use it in other sectors to speed things up is a really exciting component of the research we do, and something I've been spending quite a lot of time over the last few years trying to promote.
That is one, breaking down silos. I see that as being a very, very important thing to be done, across all sectors, really. And what you just said, it reminds me, I did a story years ago in London. There in North London, there's a bio facility where they have, some of the nastiest diseases, the Ebolas and all that sort of stuff. And I did a story there many years ago and actually got access into that building. And it was one of the more rigid security sort of processes I've been through. There was a lot of checks and balances to get in there, but it also means that you have to play with these diseases. You have to handle them. You need to have access to them, and that may mean transporting them across borders to where you have facilities. So how does that process work? What are the risks and all that sort of stuff that come with that?
Look, so that's the whole world of containment and containment facilities and building containment facilities that allow you to contain different kinds of pathogens, right? And it goes from containment level 1 to containment level 4. And containment level 4 is where you hold your highly pathogenic human diseases. And those facilities are incredibly sophisticated, and I can't go into the details, but the mechanisms to be able to allow people to work on them both by protecting themselves and ensuring that those diseases can't get out are incredibly complicated, but very important for us to be able to work on them in ourselves and do the research. But I'll tell you a bit of a funny story about that. So Australia has this amazing facility, the Australian ACDP, the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness down in Geelong, which is one of the biggest level 4 containment facilities in the world. It was opened in the mid-80s, was designed and built so that Australia could work and understand foot and mouth disease. It was an animal health facility, and it was designed to allow us to work on foot and mouth disease under high containment, all right? Now, as we speak, in that facility, they have Ebola in storage, and they can work on Ebola on the level, at level 4 containment, all right? Mm-hmm. We have never, ever been allowed, and this is where the public acceptability side and the human side of it comes in. We've never, even though we build a facility to work on foot and mouth disease, we have never, ever been allowed to bring the foot and mouth disease virus into that facility. So we built a facility to work on foot and mouth disease,
but not foot and mouth.
We can work on Ebola, but we can't work on foot and mouth disease, right? Now, on top of that, if we were allowed to work on foot and mouth disease in that facility, right, we would only actually need to work on it at level 3 containment. So that's the irony of how the containment, the containment, having a containment facility is very important, but the politics and the public relations around what you do in those facilities is often very complicated.
We are a very curious species. Let me just put
We
it
are.
that way, in terms of our nuances, and I guess one final question before we go. The different cultures that you get to work with, talking about the nuances of human prioritization. How do you find the challenges in terms of different levels of prioritization, or different concepts around different aspects of your work?
Oh, well, I think so there are two components to this. The first is risk assessment, which I've talked about, and the second is prioritization. And I see them as two very different processes, right? Risk assessment or risk analysis is where you compile all the scientific information you need to be able to evaluate a certain level of risk, right? So it's the science, it's the rigorous science component. When you come to prioritize, that prioritization is most often, in terms of big issues, is more often done by government. And governments, they use the risk assessment, they use the evidence, they use the science, but they have to take into account other considerations, as we've just talked about. And so the way they prioritize is not just based on the science, it's based by other social and political factors, right? And so the prioritization is not done by scientists, it's done by governments. And they have to make those calls. But what we try and do is make sure at least the scientific evidence that they have to be able to make those calls is the best it can possibly be. But the last thing at the end of the day that you want is the scientists actually doing the prioritization.
Andy, thank you so very, very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, well, I've really enjoyed it, Ash. So, yes, thank you very much.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Andy Sheppard. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to Ash Cloud.